Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We'll now proceed with the second session on unlocking human freedom, measures and responses to drug and human trafficking. Ms. Ashane Ekena, Executive Director of International Refugee Rights Initiative, will moderate the session. Ms. Ashane, thank you very much for joining us. You have the floor. Thank you.
And pre-forum, it is my privilege to be, thank you very much to the very consistent in providing platforms for dialogue on some of the most pressing issues facing Africa today. So session one has laid for us the groundwork. And so during this session two, we will be discussing regional responses to human and drug trafficking. We'll be examining challenges, positive results and lessons learned. We'll be looking at the role of continental and regional mechanisms as well as member states in curbing the effects of human and drug trafficking in Africa, as well as practical and operable solutions to the current challenges. With me, I have a very eminent panel this afternoon. I have Ms. Rahimat Momodu, who is the head of Human Security and Civil Society Division in the Directorate of Humanitarian and Social Affairs in the Department of Social Affairs and Gender of the ECOWAS Commission. She was a pioneer ECOWAS representative to the African Union for 10 years and the pioneer president of the ECOWAS Commission Women's Forum. She holds three master's degrees, and is a Chevening Scholar and an alumna of the International Visitors Leadership Program on Human Rights Advocacy. She is a member of many networks and institutions and was recognized as one of the 107 Nigerian women who chose to challenge in commemoration of the 2021 International Women's Day. With me, I also have Mr. Richard Chellen. Mr. Richard Chellen is the senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, ENACT, enhancing Africa's response to transnational organized crime. Richard is a senior researcher at ISS and is focused on organized crime, corruption, governance, and its impact on human security. His previous experience includes working on issues of transitional justice and terrorism, and he holds a master's cum laude in conflict transformation and peace studies from University of KwaZulu-Natal. With us also, we have, please forgive me because to spare my tongue, I will say Ms. Noma Topazi, who is the head of the SADC Liaison Office to the AU based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. We also have Ms. Maria Kisumbi, Senior Advisor, Policy and Government Relations at Humanity United. Maria is part of a team that supports the Foundation's efforts to influence and strengthen public policy on human trafficking and violent conflict. Prior to joining Humanity United, Maria was the Senior Human Rights and Governance Technical Advisor to the Uganda National Planning Authority and a coordinator for Law Uganda. Maria is an alumna of the Law and Advocacy for Women in Africa program and the Women in Public Policy Fellowship program at Georgetown University Law Center, and she has a master's degree in global health law. As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, we have quite a significant panel before us today, experts from various fields, and we look forward to hearing what they have to share with us. I would like to break it up and maybe start with each of you as my panelists taking one of the questions, maybe responding for about 10 minutes. We can follow up with more responses for another 5 minutes and then take questions from the floor before coming back for final responses from the panelists. So maybe I can start with Ms. Rahimat. Feel free to correct me if I've said it wrongly. Ms. Rahimat. Before. Oh my goodness.
I did not hear the question, but we heard you at the beginning.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so Ms. Rahimat, my question is, could you please tell us what the current situation and regional responses to human and drug trafficking have been? What are the, have there been any reform of laws, prosecution of criminals, disruption of network of crimes, coordination amongst countries, or any other initiatives that you may know of?
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and good afternoon to everyone. I would like to start off by saying, in addition to what Maureen said earlier in the morning session, there is a need for us to focus not just on the intersection between human and drug trafficking, but also arms trafficking, especially against the theme of this year's Tana High-Level Forum. And that's what we do in ECOWAS, bringing the three together under the thematic response of trans-border organized crime. So for us at ECOWAS, we are not only dealing with drug trafficking, trafficking in person separately, but we are including that of response to trans-border organized crime. And that is why we have developed a relevant text in this regard. And we are currently implementing a project funded by the EU and partly by the government of Germany called Okwati, and Okwati means Organized Crime West African Response to Trafficking. And when we say trafficking, we're talking about trafficking in these three dimensions. So I just wanted to say that that's very important if we are to unlock human freedom. And for us, an approach we are promoting right now, I think Maureen also alluded to that as part of her proposal for solution. The approach we are currently promoting in ECOWAS is the integrated human security approach, which we articulate to mean establishment and strengthening of protection web. We are seeing the issue of addressing vulnerability and victimization of all manner under a whole country, a whole society approach to creating a protection web around the individual. So we are not seeing things separately in silos. We are actually promoting the programming approach and change of mindset or paradigm of having a whole society approach to responding to addressing vulnerability and victimization of the individual, not just in relation to trafficking in persons and other vulnerability. We are taking it in totality. And because of that, my division has just started intervention in member states, which we call the high-level advocacy, capacity building and coordination intervention in member states. And we've just done that of the Gambia and Sierra Leone. What we do is a 5-day mission into the member states, and we deal on all issues: trafficking in persons, child rights, gender-based violence, international humanitarian law, drug trafficking, trafficking in persons. We all take all these issues that tend to contribute to the vulnerability and increase the victimization of the individual, take it holistically and promote a whole of government approach. And one of the outcomes of this intervention is establishment of what we call protection and human security integrated coordination mechanism, which is a mechanism that puts the government of our member states, non-state actors, civil society, media, and the private sector together in a platform to drive the process of protection and human security. And of course, central to this is trafficking in persons. We just came back from the Sierra Leone, and the Vice President of Sierra Leone, out of this initiative, committed Sierra Leone to leading the process of developing what Sierra Leone is calling a trafficking in person regional ecosystem within West Africa to strengthen interstate cooperation in terms of addressing the issue of trafficking in persons and other related vulnerabilities and victimization. We are also very much aware of the need to support member states in ECOWAS. For the last 17 years, we hold what we call annual review meeting with the focal institutions working in the area of trafficking in person. And we have a network of those national institutions that enhances regional cooperation. And for the last 17 years, we have produced annual synthesis report on the issue of trafficking in person. So when Maureen was talking about the high level of trafficking in person in West Africa and perhaps related to the regime of free movement, she also mentioned in response to my question that it could also be because it is easy to collect data from West Africa, and that is very true. ECOWAS has worked so well with our member states that we have enhanced the collection of data in the area of drug trafficking. We have a network called WENDU, and we have built the capacity of these WENDU actors to collect data. So it is very, very easy. Also with trafficking in person, like I said, we've been having annual meetings, collecting data, producing annual reports. So it's quite easy for anyone doing research to get, data, quality data on issues of trafficking in persons and drug trafficking in West Africa. Perhaps that's why you have that high rate in terms of data because ECOWAS has supported member states in this regard. We also have many texts that are supporting our work against trafficking in persons and drug trafficking. There are a lot. We have the child policy and strategic action plan, which deals with that. We have the national child protection system, strengthening to prevent response to violence, abuse, and exploitation of children. We have the ECOWAS Regional Action Plan for elimination of the worst forms of labor, of child labor. We have the ECOWAS Plan of Action to combat trafficking in persons. We have the ECOWAS General Convention on Social Security, which covers labor migrants, especially in the formal sector. We're also finalizing the ECOWAS Regional Social Protection Framework, which is to provide that protection that we are talking about, to enhance a protection web around the individual and also to the society in general. We are currently finalizing a strategy for strengthening protection in the context of mixed migration. And this goes to show that ECOWAS has been very much involved in the area of trafficking in persons and drug trafficking. We are moving on to a second phase of a project we call Free Movement and Migration, which is also funded by the EU in partnership with UNODC, IOM, and ICMPD. And in this second phase, we are planning to initiate an ECOWAS Gulf States dialogue on migration, or irregular migration, given the state of trafficking that we heard about in the morning, which I don't want to repeat. In terms of partnership, we work with a lot of people in the area of children's protection or child protection. We work with regional partners group, UN agencies, and all those who work in the area of child protection. In the area of children on the move, as you know, children are quite they are very vulnerable. We have a network we call West African Network against children on the move, in partnership with ISS, that's International Social Services, not the ISS in the hall. And in supporting the member states, beyond the annual review meetings, we also produce annual reports. We also do peer learning and an exchange. And so ECOWAS has been on top of issues of trafficking in persons, and we've been building capacity in data collection and response. Also at the political level, in addition to those texts are adopted by the heads of state, but we also have a declaration, a political declaration against trans-organized crime, and we are currently trying to develop a convention that puts everything together, trafficking in persons, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, in one convention, in one document that really empowers ECOWAS Commission to support member states in this regard. So generally, ECOWAS is applying a protection framework approach to the issue of trafficking in persons and other vulnerability. So our idea is that we need to apply the TIP plus approach, which does not just see trafficking in person in isolation, but to relate it to other areas of vulnerability and violation that increases the chances of somebody being trafficked and drug trafficking. So I don't want to take too much time. I'll stop here, hoping that I'll have another opportunity to talk about proposals or solutions beyond what I've just told you that ECOWAS is doing. Thank you very much, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rahimat, for such a fantastic presentation that really gave us a comprehensive overview of what's happening at ECOWAS level. I would like to go to, definitely we will come back to you. I would like to maybe go now to our next panelist, Mr. Richard Schellin from the ISS that is on the floor this afternoon. And maybe find out from Mr. Schellin, are there any significant lessons that have been learned any positive results that have been achieved, any measures that have been put to place. Has there been an impact from COVID-19, for example? Has there been a changing nature of criminals and modification of tactics? Any lessons learned around corruption and good governance in this realm?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kina. It's a pleasure to be here, and good afternoon to esteemed panel members and also to the members of the audience. Yes, I think the first thing we need to bring out, which was highlighted, I think, during the course of this forum from the morning panel to now, is that, you know, you cannot treat human trafficking, drug trafficking separately. They are organized crime, right? They fall under organized crime, and we have to accept the fact, like, they cause harm to people, they cause harm to the victims, whether it be drug trafficking and whether it be human trafficking and any other. I think the previous speaker just mentioned arms trafficking as well. So it's always, in as much as we have specific policies and frameworks meant to deal specifically with each issue, very often this is done in silos, right? I mean, so there needs to be a balanced approach, I would say, and we're starting to see that around. Also, something else as well is that these organized crime, in addition to being harms to victims, they also present national and security threats. And in that regard, then it's needs to be, you know, to address it, the responses needs to be not only focused on one type of crime, but see it as a whole. The reason being is that organized criminals are not very picky. They will go for where it is. And very often you will find that somebody involved, or a criminal organization or syndicate, as you would want to call it, is involved not only in human trafficking, but would also be involved in arms trafficking, in wildlife trafficking, in kidnapping, in human trafficking, etc. So they vary their trade according to it. And targeting that would also where it comes in as a security response and law enforcement response. It's the fact as well is that the aspect of gender. We've seen the predominant victims of, you know, drug trafficking, whether it be drug mules or human trafficking, have been women and children. Most recently, Interpol released a report, I think 2 days ago. They are our partner on the program. So they released a report on human trafficking in Southern Africa. And the finding are quite sterling. I would, you know, encourage members to have a look at the report. It's on the ISS website. But the thing as well, it would be that we have policies, we have strategies, we have protocols, we have conventions, we have, you know, the UNTOC, UNTOC, we have the protocol against trafficking of in persons, we have protocols on drug trafficking, etc., etc. The problem is very often you will find that it's not in the policy itself. The policies are designed to address the problem. But the struggle is, how do you balance the strategy? How do you bring in the balance? On the one hand, you have the factors that push people into drug trafficking and human trafficking. I'm talking individuals that are being recruited or individuals that are being targeted. And the various instances have been mentioned this morning. I won't go into it. But on the other hand, you have policies that have to deal with the criminal actors. And we've seen that there have been, especially in Southern Africa and other regions as well, I think as previous mentioned, that there's been work being done, data collection. We've seen member states adopting, signing and ratifying various conventions related to the various types of crime. But often the problem comes in when it's an implementation. Very often you will have these protocols, you will have these strategies, but sometimes it's the implementation plan. If I may just use an example, would be, let's look at the aspect of silencing the guns. On my research that I've conducted personally, you know, you have this brilliant plan of action. And I remember asking certain people who are meant to implement it, and the answer was simple. What do you mean? We haven't come across this document. What does it actually mean? So I think in terms of implementation as well, there will need to be a contextualization of each strategy. because each context is different and each of those. But we've seen greater collaboration amongst law enforcement officials. We've seen that, for instance, we've seen South Africa and Mauritius in the design of their strategies to dealing with drugs and human trafficking, that has become a more collaborative aspect as well at a national level, where you bring in different aspects such as customs, law enforcement, etc. So we've seen better results at that. But at the same time, we've seen a struggle in who takes lead on the project when it's multi-collaborative and all those admin issues. But overall, I would say we do have strategies, we do have policies, and it's a matter of getting it in the right context and contextualizing it to the context that can be responded to. Of course, there are issues with capacity, funding, resources, etc., which also needs to be taken into consideration. And also in terms of the organized crime, criminal groups, as you mentioned, how they adapted. We've seen at the beginning of COVID that it's impacted on the drug trade because of certain drugs could not be imported, for instance. But then as COVID restrictions were eased, as international trade resumed, we've seen a greater increase in the trafficking. I mean, this is noted by various seizures in media reports. We've seen seizures that we haven't noticed before. And also, the one thing about organized criminal groups are that they are very organized and very opportunistic. They are organized opportunists in a way that, you know, they will address and adapt to any situation. And at the same time, the responses will also have to be adapted to that. I mentioned previously a report by Interpol. And one of the key things that I will mention is that they've noted that organized crime groups in Africa are currently using social networking websites to study the profiles of potential victims, and in so doing, tailor the approach towards them and eventually recruit them. So we've seen that organized criminals have adapted to the online, to technology, but yet the responses and policies and strategies are not up to date to that. But having said that, we've seen that most recently, as you were seeing in the SADC summit, for instance, we've amended, SADC has amended their firearms protocol, for instance, to make it more updated. And there are work being done on transnational organized crime strategy, for instance, that look at all the aspects of organized crime rather than singly focus, addressing each component in silos. So I think there is a balance, right? On the one hand, you do have policies that are sometimes difficultly implemented, but on the others, you have that states have stepped up and said, you know what, we need to address it. We need to move at the same level. We've seen SAFCO doing it. We've seen YAPCO in East Africa, adapting, having training, capacity building to keep, moving forward to adapt, to be at the same level or even 2 steps ahead of organized criminal. So in a way, it's a bit balanced on both, but there is more work to be done. The being complacent will never help us because organized criminals are always 2 steps ahead. And that goes across the whole spectrum of the various organized crime. So for now, I will stop around now and then maybe provide later if there should be any additional comments, questions, and even suggestions as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, for your succinct presentation. If I might call you Noma, Ms. Noma Topazi, are you online or are you in the room? Okay, Ms. Noma Topazi, are you here? Okay, so maybe then we go to Maria. Maria Kisumbi, please come in and tell us, if you can, what role you feel that AU, member states, regional mechanisms, what role do you think that they should be taking, or what position should they be occupying? How should they further collaborate to curb the effects of drug and human trafficking in Africa?
Thank you for that question. It's very good to be in this space. Hello, everyone. I'm calling from Baltimore. So good morning on my end and good afternoon on your end. So I think as previous speakers have spoken, I think we should really, really emphasize the importance of using a victim-centered lens when we want to address issues of drug and human trafficking. Why I say this is like, if we do it this way, then you'll be able to see the needs from the victims and be able to ensure that they are not vulnerable and be re-trafficked again. So how do we reduce those kinds of vulnerabilities? For the African Union, there's been a lot of buzz and excitement around the Africa Continental Trade Agreement. One of the recommendations is like, how do we maximize those opportunities under the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement to guarantee the rights of the victims, and also how do we use that opportunity to be able to curb human trafficking? Why I say that is trade agreements, they provide international standards for goods, and if you incorporate language which provides protection against exploitation where people are not, to prevent human trafficking, then you'll be able to spur economic growth, but also reorient the society to combat trafficking. So why I say this is recently within the US, we have the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, and within that trade agreement, there are provisions which include forced labor provisions and creates opportunities for those who've been exploited within member states to seek justice. And if you're looking from a victim-centered lens, it's like, where's the justice for those who've been exploited? Where is the justice for those who've been victims of drug and human trafficking? Are there avenues that we can be able to provide for them under these existing spaces? Recently, one of our partners was able to file a complaint under that trade agreement, and because they were being exploited, and these were migrant women workers. So my question is, how do we advance and use the opportunities under the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement to be able to curb human trafficking? The other is member states, especially thinking around, I'm an advocate around using trade and how to use trade agreements and curbing human trafficking, is how do we enact provisions which are similar and importation of goods within member states made out of forced labor? Because I feel like one form of human trafficking, labor exploitation, which a lot of times is very much ignored, is how do we ensure that goods that are made out of forced labor really have no harbor within our member states? I feel if that is done, then we'll be able to contribute and be able to curb human trafficking, because that's where the money is. And if we ensure that these goods don't have any market, I think it's also an avenue in how we can reduce human trafficking and drug trafficking. Just recently, I think it was in 2019, US issued a withhold release order where goods that were made, or tobacco goods that were coming to the US was stopped from coming because there was information that they were made out of forced labor. So it made me think, like, imagine we have those kinds of forced labor import provisions within our member states. I think we'll be able to not even have market for these goods coming in, and then in the end, then we'll be able to have, and not even have that deter people from practicing human trafficking and drug trafficking. Yeah, so.
Okay, thank you so much, Maria. That was, I really aligned with your issue about taking a victim-centered approach. If I might just I'll come back to you. Maybe let's go first back to Ms. Rahimat. Ms. Rahimat, you had given us this very comprehensive framework of institutions and instruments that are available within ECOWAS for dealing with transnational crime in a holistic way. My question to you is, how do these then translate into concrete action? How do they move from paper to become more practical and operable solutions for the challenges that we face in this room?
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Yes, I gave an example in the area of data collection, it has become very clear that the efforts of ECOWAS on ground has increased the amount of data collected, which is really informing ECOWAS response and the response of member states. Like I said, in supporting the member states, we interface with member states very regularly, in the different areas, whether trafficking in persons, drug trafficking, and the general transnational organized crime approach. So yes, in concrete terms, what we do at the regional level is beginning to produce results. Beyond data collection, when it comes to drug, we have established coordination mechanism nationally within each member state that ensures that countries are able to, national institutions that are working in the area of drug trafficking, for example, constitute a national a coordination committee, so they work together. So that has increased their output and the outcome on ground. ECOWAS is very much involved with Interpol, for example, and UNODC in terms of training, capacity building, in terms of trying to enhance forensic capacity, for example, for the drug law enforcement agencies in our member state. We also have training training of those who work in the area of drug education, in terms of building the capacity of prevention educators. In the area of trafficking in person, I have told you that for the last 17 years, we have a network of national institutions which we meet with every year. We produce the report. We discuss, for example, the US report on trafficking in person. We do a lot of peer learning. Only last year, ECOWAS, for example, initiated a bilateral high-level engagement between Nigeria and Mali, for example. As you know, there is a very, serious case of trafficking of young girls from Nigeria to north of Mali, and you know the situation of Mali. So the ECOWAS Commission is facilitating a bilateral agreement and engagement between Mali. So these are concrete results. Capacities of member states have been built. ECOWAS is also supporting member states materially in terms of equipment in data collection and in other issues in trafficking in persons, especially in drug trafficking. Concretely, based on the political declaration like that I talked about in terms of transnational organized crime, we will follow that up with a convention which tends to bind the member states to a certain threshold of response, or to some level of standardization and harmonization. So concretely on ground, we begin to see results. I've just told you of the 2 missions to the Gambia and Sierra Leone, and the establishment of an integrated human security and protection mechanism is beginning to, we're going to build on the momentum for next year. We'll cover 5 countries in 2021 this year. We're going to cover additional 5 countries next year, and then in 2023, the final 5 countries. So we have a situation that concretely on ground, our member states are better equipped, and not just because of the regional text, which ECOWAS has an oversight to ensure compliance, but also based on ECOWAS sensitization. As you know, you may not know, ECOWAS is currently establishing institutional presence in all our member states. So we have what we call the ECOWAS permanent representative to our member states, pretty much like what the UN has in some cases. So we have the ECOWAS permanent representative in all member states, except Senegal and Sierra Leone, and I think that will be done before the end of this year. And these permanent representatives are like the extension of the ECOWAS Secretariat in member states. And this is in addition to the ECOWAS national offices that we have in each member state foreign ministry, depending on each member state. So the ECOWAS institutional presence is increasing in member states, and that's because we need to push the agenda of human security the agenda of protection in general, concerning the well-being and prosperity of an average West African. We need to push that and extend the ECOWAS Commission's ability to intervene in member states, to support member states, and more importantly, to also mobilize resources in terms of material and non-material resources to support member states in this regard. So yes, we are very optimistic that things are happening in our member state, but we also know that we need to do more. That's why we started the new approach of an integrated response when it concerns the protection and the human security. We believe a whole of government approach, a whole of civil society approach is very important. I mean, we need to promote the civil society working with the government in tandem. For example, when we were in Sierra Leone, it became very clear that one of the areas that we need to focus on, which ECOWAS is doing, but we need to enhance our effort, is in working with our cross-border communities who usually feel very distant from the central government. And that's where most of this trafficking take place. So there was talk about trying to build, have a kind of joint border protection, sensitive joint border management, if I may put it that way, so that our border communities will be part of the fight against trafficking, all forms, trafficking, person, transnational organized crime. And already, with the support of the EU, ECOWAS is building what we call joint border post. It has been done between Nigeria and Cotonou. I think Ghana and Togo is going on. There are about 6 or 7 that will be built around the West African region. So ECOWAS is very much aware of this and already has a human security approach to addressing this issue of transnational organized crime. While my department deals with the social dimension of these issues, the Department of Political Affairs and Security has the oversight over the transnational organized crime, and we have some instruments already and some text already under the Department of Political Affairs that is dealing with issues of transnational organized crime. For example, we have the West African Police Committee, WAPO. There's also the West African, I'm trying to remember, Information System, WAPC, with support with the EU, Interpol, and to an extent UNODC. So these are structures that are already operational, very much operational on ground, and we're beginning to see the results. In the morning session, somebody was talking about maritime security, and I had responded briefly on the chat. For the maritime security, ECOWAS has a cooperation with ECAS, for example. There's joint border patrol. We also have established maritime hubs. We have about, if my memory serves me right, we have about 3 maritime security hubs within West Africa where we do joint patrol. We have the centers. So things are happening. There's concrete results on ground. But like somebody said, the criminals are more sophisticated in some cases. So we just really need to upscale our responses, have a more protection approach, and to continue to promote a whole government and a whole society approach to addressing the issues of all forms of vulnerabilities and victimization and violations of the rights and the dignity of an individual or of a person. So I'll stop here, and I hope to take questions later, or maybe when I'm rounding up, to give more solutions or to what I think we should be doing as collectively as Africa.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Rahimat. In fact, that's where I was going to go next. Maria, you spoke about the importance of having a victim-centered approach. How do we accomplish the victim-centered approach? You mentioned, for example, the AF, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Are there other intersections with other continental and regional mechanisms, whether on governance, on health, on peace, on security, on human rights that exist? And how do we connect so that we're not working in the silos that Richard made reference to earlier?
Yes, actually, you've said something very important. Human rights. I think if we apply adoption of a human rights-based approach, I think that is where we'll have less of these silos and more of us being able to work together. And even why I also say this is if we apply a human rights-based approach, this is where we'll be able to put victims at the center of all these policies. In these discussions, I would be so excited if we had survivors and victims leading us in these discussions and letting us know how is it that we can be able to contribute and curb human trafficking. If we use a human rights-based approach, just as said as the previous speaker, we will certainly guarantee the rights of the individuals just by being human and centering them as the holder of rights rather than them just being merely as victims. We'll also be able to identify and redress the discriminatory practices and unjust distributions of power that underlie trafficking and maintain the impunity for traffickers and deny justice for victims of trafficking. It will also place the importance and inclusion of survivors and survivor leaders who will be able to be leading us in developing solutions to curb human trafficking and drug trafficking. It will also help us strengthen the capacity building of duty bearers and rights holders. And also, it will also allow us to address the root causes of human trafficking. So even in these current policies that are in place, if we apply and use a human rights-based approach in implementing this, I think there'll be less of the silos and more of cooperation and really focus on how do we ensure that these individuals are not re-trafficked. I'll reduce the vulnerabilities because there's this issue, you rescue and then again, the cycle continues. How do we stop that? I think it's super important for us. I think, I don't know, it was the gentleman from ISS who says we have very many laws, we have very many policies, but implementation is a problem. So it's how do we look at the current laws in place and policies in place and be able to implement them using a human rights-based approach and where you center the survivors and victims to be able to lead us in finding these solutions.
Thank you very much, Maria. I was actually going to come to Richard next. And for Richard, I was going to ask you, you had made mention of research. It's a bit of a convoluted question, so bear with me a little bit. We know that on the continent, we don't really have very clear borders, and most of the people who move don't necessarily move through legitimate points of crossing. At some point today, there's been mention of a lack of data, and Ms. Rehamat mentioned that one of the reasons why ECOWAS is mentioned or is visible is because there is available data around trafficking. Is this an issue for being able to control human and drug trafficking? If we're suddenly able to monitor people's crossings and have definite statistics about who's crossing and where they're crossing, will this help to curb the trend in human and drug trafficking across the continent?
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I think it's a very interesting and very complex issue. I think it's something that we always ask, right? So on the one hand, you have, policymakers. Sometimes, we say, we complain about the policies that are being made. We complain about, they can't be implemented. But very often you will find, especially issues such as drug trafficking, human trafficking, the lack of data that exists. I think that's key. for the moment, if I may just put a question out there, is that how do we know that law enforcement is doing a good job? Very often it's based on the seizure data, right? We see that so-and-so seized 5 tons of heroin in the past 2 days, right? And that's an indication of, okay, they're doing great work. But the one thing we tend to forget is that a seizure is only a tiny fraction of what actually the market consists of. So maybe not even, it's less than a quarter, less than 1/10, right? So in a way, it doesn't give us an accurate picture of what's really happening. We just have to multiply it by more. And very often we find that at policy level, it's very difficult because of the lack of data. And indeed, I think that's very encouraging that comes from Ms. Rahimat, where she says, ECOWAS is actually collecting data. And I think that will go a long way to inform policies. And also, as Maria pointed out, sometimes when we look at policies, they are formulated without the people on the ground. And one of the recommendations that came out from one of the law enforcement agencies in one of the countries was that, we need to learn from survivors of human trafficking, because that is the key to shaping policy and changing attitudes on human trafficking. So we need to get that. And one country that did that, I think, was Mauritius in terms of their drugs. There could be others that maybe I'm not aware of. But before designing the strategy, they brought in all the government department, etc. But they also brought in civil society. They brought in civil society because, for instance, if we look at drug trafficking and in the drug sector, is that very often harm reduction, preventative measures, and demand reduction is conducted by CSOs mostly, civil society, and bringing them to the table brings that added function, because government sometimes is very limited in doing preventative measures, right? And I think the same can be said to other aspects. So definitely lack of data, but encouraging. I think ECOWAS, is as Mr. Hermet is saying, they're setting a good ground, right? And I think other regions should follow in that, in creating more data. And in that, it's not only helps researchers to work on it, but also law enforcement, but also policymakers can get information that can further build into policy, make it more in touch with reality. Not that it's out of touch, but sometimes you have a very limited hand to deal with. The issue of border control as well was brought up in quite a few law enforcement, is that, if we have better data, but also border control can be a very controversial issue, right? Depending on the policies, right? So I think but in terms of human trafficking and smuggling, if we may bring it in that way, that it does come in, but also at the same time is implementation of this, or bringing in border control, but respecting human rights at the same time. I think that's critical, respecting the human rights, but implementing a policy that, multi-pronged, but that also looks at the human rights aspect, because very often we've seen policies can be quite, condemning. We've seen it in the drug space where users get sentenced to very harsh punishments, right? So sometimes we also have this balance that needs to come in. So yeah, I will end it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is very interesting. I wonder, Rubiat, can I call on you to assist me? Since I don't have a view of the hall, could somebody please assist me to take questions, if we have any questions from the floor for the panelists?
Thanks very much to the panelists and for very excellent inputs, but also to the chair. I have just one question, and that really stems from the centrality of the state in all the discussions about the response. And we are hearing all of the state kind of response, state capacity building, and all of that. My question is, in situations where the state itself is captured, especially regards to not just drug trafficking, but also other forms of smuggling, in which key campaigns have access to so much resources that either specific locations or specific sectors or even the security agencies of the state are completely compromised and captured. How do you go about all of these state-centered responses and manage it in a way that is positive? Thank you.
We have additional questions, so
yeah, thanks. I wanted to compliment, thanks to the panelists and the contribution I make. I wanted to compliment the remarks that Andrew has made and ask a question, especially in relation to not just areas or where the state is functioning, but also in spaces where the state has no control. And here I'm bringing in the dimension of the actions of non-state armed groups, and I wanted just to understand, especially if Ms. Rahmat would comment what the experience has been, especially within the Western African region, in Sahel in particular, whether there is a conversation there also to extend that thinking in terms of response in tackling also the question linked with the overall peace and security environment, where the non-state armed groups are functioning, and where then the whole question of trafficking, not just on human, but also arms trafficking and other related acts of criminality. Thanks.
Thank you so much to the panelists that presented in this session, and for the useful information that you have given to us. For me, it was quite a lot of learning. My question, the first one, goes to the presentation coming from ECOWAS. Just wanting to find out, I mean, in terms of the information that you're seeing and that's coming through, whether you are seeing the cases going down, but also what cooperation there is with neighboring regional economic communities. Like we hear that West Africa to North Africa might be a route where, which is being used from West Africa up to North Africa. What kind of cooperation is there between, for example, ECOWAS and maybe the Maghreb region of the African Union? My second question also goes to maybe all these transboundary crimes, really looking at, because I come from the Southern Africa region, and I kind of like really thinking like people who are moving across borders, most of them, they get assistance from, they know that the border is being controlled or whatever, but there is lots of corruption and bribery that goes on there. So the people that actually are responsible for protecting the borders, in terms of really looking at this from the corruption and bribery perspective. That's one perspective, but the reality is also for people who live across or on the borders, the reality is that they are one community, usually a community from this side and that side, and they have always had interactions since time immemorial. There are times when borders tighten up, and you really think that at some point they would disconnect. When things begin to normalize, you actually see that kinship and that relationship between people across the borders actually going on. And I think it is a reality in Africa, and I think it is something that we need to take cognizance of those border communities, because you find them across, and they definitely cross the borders because they are one people. And so really thinking it, I think what somebody was talking about, really like this community or victim center, I think it will be important to kind of like understudy and really understand how we can deal with such kind of communities across the borders. My last one really looks at the whole issue of forced labor. Like I said, when I see cases for people who cross borders to go and work in neighboring countries, sometimes it's not an issue of forced labor itself, but maybe also to add in a whole issue of decent wages, because people walk up to these jobs, and these are adults, not really like people who are a certain age below, but really how do we ensure that people who find themselves entangled in these situations, they are also able to get decent wages? Because there's lots of exploitation, and there's also lots of preferences for these people who are coming from outside because they are desperate, so they can take up anything. So besides forced labor, I think there's also a dimension of decent wages. Thank you.
Do we have anyone? Ms. Ashen, that would be all from the floor. Over to you. Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you so much. Kaba, would you like to say your question now? Hello? Mr. Kaba? Monsieur Kaba?
Allô?
Oui? Monsieur Kaba? Allons-y. Allô?
Vous nous entendez?
Oui, oui.
Ok. Bonjour, Madame la modératrice. Bonjour à tout le monde et bonjour à tous les participants. C'est avec plaisir que je participe.
Great pleasure that I'm participating to this kind of forum. On this 19 August, and I'd like to first congratulate the organizers for dealing with this topic, access to human liberty, drug trafficking, human trafficking. And since this morning I wanted to take the floor, but I had connectivity issues. But it's a very interesting topic, and I think we need to have a coordination regarding the different initiatives, the Rabat initiative and the Khartoum initiative. And I think the good coordination between the RECs, the AU, and regional mechanisms, I think we can efficiently fight against this scourge that is affecting the African continent. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. I will come back to our panelists first, and then we'll see if there are any hands left. Thank you everybody for your questions. Our panelists, I won't be prescriptive, allow you to take the questions in any way you would like. Maybe Ms. Rahimat, would you like to go first? There were specific questions for you.
Yes, thank you as usual. There's questions for ECOWAS. Yes, I'll start from the first question in terms of centrality of the state, and that in case of a state capture or when state institutions are compromised, how do we, in this case, how does ECOWAS, support? For us, we try as much as possible not to deal with only the member state or the states, as it were. And of course, the mantra of Vision 2020, which is also, the mantra for the new Vision 2050 that is being finalized, which is moving from the ECOWAS of state to the ECOWAS of the people. And so for us, involvement of the civil society underpins what we do. So we try to have this balanced approach while dealing with the government. We also include the civil society. In fact, we are beginning to strengthen our connection with the private sector, which has been a missing link for a long time. We are beginning to do that. So yes, we have our interventions also with the civil society. And like I just told you, our integrated approach, which we just started, led to the creation of an integrated coordination we lead to the establishment of an integrated coordination mechanism of both the government, non-state actors, civil society, private sector, and the media. So for us as an approach, we don't deal with only the government institutions alone. That's why in almost all our different areas of intervention, we have a network of civil society that we deal with. very regularly. In the case of trafficking in person, there is a network that is currently being developed that ECOWAS is trying to work with. It's not developed by ECOWAS, but by another project funded by the EU, I think. In the case of drug trafficking, we have the WANSA, the West African Civil Society, currently under the Okwati project. As we speak, I'm supposed to be in another meeting, but because it's happening at the same time, which is the creation of a mechanism for civil society oversight on member states when it comes to transnational organized crime. So that is the double-pronged approach that ECOWAS deploys, and we believe in this because, like I've said before, we have a human security approach to our intervention, and when we talk about human security, human rights approach is embedded in that. It goes beyond a human rights approach. It's talking about addressing the survival, the sustainable livelihood, and the dignity of an individual. So for us, it's all wrapped under the human security approach to respond. So that's what I will respond to, that we deal with the state, but at the same time, we engage the civil society organization, and that for us helps to put pressure on the state, also helps to monitor the state, and also is able to give us gaps in terms of what you call state capture or state compromise, as the case may be. In terms of the action of non-state armed groups, whether especially in the Sahel, of course, when we talk about ECOWAS, we're also talking about the Sahel region, part of ECOWAS. There's a lot of engagement in that regard. Last year, ECOWAS finalized a roadmap and an action plan that was adopted by the heads of state concerning our response to terrorism and extreme violence in the Sahel region, which is currently being implemented. And under this project, which is for now funded by ECOWAS, although we are looking for additional resources to upscale the implementation of that project, we are engaged in this regard with people. I already talked about two very important instruments institutions that we have, the WAPCO, which is the West African Police and Security Committee, which involves all security, heads of security in our 15 member states. We also have the information system that was just launched, I think earlier this year, which also helps in information sharing and to inform our response in this regard. So a lot is happening regarding our interface in this regard, and I think we are beginning to see results in terms of cooperation across countries and in terms of compliance with some of the texts that we have. I think the same person also asked, maybe another person, are cases going down? Because of the better reporting system, the capacity that we have built in our member states, and we are seeing more data being collected, more reporting, no, cases may not be going down because we now have more cases reported. It could mean that cases are going down, but because more cases are reported, there is no statistical evidence that cases are going down. But what we have noticed that is going up or doing well is in terms of the member state capacity to respond. Like I said, we are working on many fronts and we are working in an integrated manner. So our capacities of member states have been built. You see that in the response. You see it in the capacity of individuals working in national institutions. And you also see it in the capacity of non-state actors or civil society working collaboratively with national institutions. For example, under the Okwati project, we have what we call demand-driven facility, which is supporting member states in terms of response to trafficking in person and other related crimes in member states. There was a first round. Now we are in the second round of providing that support to national institutions, and compulsorily they must work with with civil society. So we are beginning to see results in the willingness, in the ability, in the structures, in the institutions of member states, and in their response to issues of vulnerabilities of all kinds. In terms of cooperation between ECOWAS and the Maghreb region, it's part of what I said earlier on, that in the second phase of the project we call FMM, we are going to explore not just the cooperation with the Maghreb region, but also with the Gulf states. As you know, that is another dimension of trafficking in person in terms of exploitation of labor that we see that is very serious. And we want to do this so that we as ECOWAS can provide the regional cover for our member states to then perhaps enter into bilateral agreement with some of these states. But we believe that it will be stronger if ECOWAS provides that regional cover, provides that regional capacity, so that member states will be in a better position to have bilateral agreements with individual countries, whether in the Maghreb or in the Gulf states. In terms of corruption in the border, you are very correct. Corruption in the border is a very serious issue. That it's one of the reasons that ECOWAS is trying the strategy of building joint border posts. In 2016, ECOWAS also adopted, beside the common international passport that all ECOWAS citizens hold, ECOWAS adopted the biometric ID card. I think it has been deployed by Senegal and, if I'm correct, Cabo Verde. As of last year, Nigeria had disbursed money for Nigeria to do that. What that means is that every West African citizen will have a common biometric ID card, which you will use to cross the border. So that what happens at the joint border is, once I get to the joint border, my card is slipped into the machine. It reads everything about me, criminal record, everything about me. So that is our next level of trying to check corruption at the border, and also to really make free movement free without corruption and without harassment. I don't think the question about the forced labor is only addressed to me. I think I agree with you, what you talked about. But the last question from my brother from Guinea, I did not hear him very well, but those are the questions that were directed at ECOWAS. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Robert. Mr. Richard Chellen, would you like to tackle some of the questions?
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think Dr. Andrew brings up some very good question, but also a very difficult question to answer. What happens, because all these policies and all these frameworks are geared towards states to implement? And what happens when you have a captured state? Like, for instance, what happens when the government or the ruling party is benefiting from the illegal drug trade, which comes in as campaign finance, etc. How do you deal with that? And also, I think when we talked about captured state as well, depending on the capture, but I think one of the most, usually it's the capture of the intelligence services, capture of the judiciary and prosecuting officers. And I think the most common one, the difficult one to address, especially in regard to addressing organized crime, is the capture of law enforcement. What happens when the institution or department that is meant to uphold the law or get people to uphold the law are the ones that are breaking it? And what happens in that case when the whole state is captured? I think that then, unfortunately, not much can be done, right? But we've seen that in several countries that civil society, the role that civil society play. We've seen in the case of countries, we've seen Transparency Internationals, we've seen organizations like, the ISS, with many civil society organizations that are currently present at this forum as well, the role that they play. And as much as it could be limited, but I think it's an important role that you bring in. But also, I think this is where the regional bodies also play a major role, where they can come in as a collective and say, listen up, these are the things that are happening. But until such time, corruption and organized crime will flourish. So very often the burden falls on the private sector, which very often we've seen have also been complicit in the capture of the state. So usually civil society is the lone voice that actually speaks out, and very often at very high cost as well. On the issue of borders, I think that's very interesting, very common, and I think I didn't get the name of the member of the audience who asked it, but I did say it's from Southern Africa. I think one example I would say is the border between South Africa and Lesotho, for instance, where it's not really one step where you step once in South Africa and the next step you're in Lesotho, right? But yet, as he mentioned, the family, the bond, it's the same people. It's just, what they say, borders are merely a construct. It's artificial, right? But having said that as well, organized criminal capitalize on that. And I think one of the key crimes that I mentioned, Lesotho and South Africa, is we've seen livestock theft, or what is known as cattle rustling, quite a common effect there. And we've seen also, the trafficking of arms and stolen vehicles as well. So yes, in as much as, we cannot differentiate borders, but also criminals are adapting to that and are using that as opportunities to target it. So I think it's like I mentioned, it needs to have a balanced approach. Yeah, and that's it from me. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Richard Chalin. Mario, would you like to comment or respond to any of the questions that were raised on the floor?
Yes, I would want to talk about the one around forced labor and linking it, addressing forced labor with linking it to wages. ILO really provides indicators of what forced labor looks like. Not only is it about withholding wages, but there's also abuse of vulnerability, physical and sexual violence, debt bondage, and abusive living conditions. So in order to be able to determine whether there's forced labor within a certain situation, there are different indicators that need to come into place. And not only are we looking at withholding wages, but what are the other conditions which are in place which create someone to be a victim of forced labor and labor exploitation, which is a different form of human trafficking. As I had mentioned earlier, I think it's important for us to see how do we use the current Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement to be able to advance labor rights and to be able to prevent goods that are made out of forced labor to thrive within our member states. I think that is one way of how we can be able to curb forced labor. It's been an effective tool. Civil society organizations and migrant worker organizations, especially here based in the US, have been using trade tools to be able to address issues of forced labor and be able to get justice and be able to hold corporations and companies accountable who are using forced labor in production of these goods. So I think within the continent, a question for us all is how do we capitalize and maximize the current Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement to advance the rights of workers and to be able to advance labor and worker rights as a means of curbing forced labor, as a means of curbing human trafficking and drug trafficking.
Okay, thank you so much, Maria. I just have a final question, and any of the panelists may feel free to take it. I think Monsieur Kaba's question has not really been addressed, and I missed part of it, but I did catch the part when he was speaking about some of the external initiatives on migration that we have on the continent. And I was wondering what impact that has, particularly after what we saw in Libya and now the rush by a number of European countries to externalize their borders and have third-party countries process their asylum claims. I wonder if that will have an impact, particularly on human trafficking. If any of the panelists have a comment on that, I'd be interested to hear it. Before you respond, maybe you can take with this question, which is specifically for Ms. Rahimat Momodu. or anyone who might be able to respond. The question from Jesutimilehin Akamo. I hope I did not massacre your name too badly. There's no doubt that security in the Gulf of Guinea requires joint efforts from ECOWAS and ECAS within the context of transnational organized crime, especially trafficking. Hence my question, what opportunities are there for better collaboration between both institutions? MOWCA does not seem to be working out, or are there alternatives to MOCA or MOWCA that is less complex and more feasible? So if we could just maybe get a response to those last two questions in 2 minutes each, and then we...
Thank you very much. I don't know what MOWCA is, but I thought I had mentioned that, okay, and I wrote in the chat during the morning session that ECOWAS is very much involved in collaboration with ECAS, Central Africa. In 2018, I think there was a joint summit of heads of states between ECOWAS and ECAS. Even before then, long before then, ECOWAS and ECAS had been working in the area of trafficking in person. We have a text in that regard. We have always collaborated when it comes to trafficking in person. I also talked about the joint ECOWAS-ECAS maritime security collaboration. I thought I had alluded to that very much in the morning in the chat, and also when I was speaking, that in terms of collaboration, we are collaborating with ECAS to the extent that we had a joint, I think that was the first time where two regions in Africa, two regs, had a joint ministerial and joint head of state meeting, and it was purely in the area of insecurity, maritime trafficking in person, and transnational organized crime. So yes, there is that cooperation going on, and we have a joint maritime security center with ECAS. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rahima. Was there anyone willing to tackle the question on migration and the connection with human trafficking?
Yes, wait. What is the question? Where is it?
Okay, so it's not in the chat. Monsieur Kaba had made mention, like I said, I did not catch his whole question, but essentially he was referring to the migration initiatives that we have primarily with the European Union. I'm not sure what the actual question was there, but I think he said that these should help us to curb human trafficking issues. My question, which I added onto that, was after what happened in Libya, and now that we are seeing many more European countries externalizing their borders and asylum procedures to third-party countries, is that likely to have an impact on human trafficking?
I think maybe I can try and answer. It's a very complicated, complex question. But I think a lot of times we need to understand that migrants face a lot of vulnerabilities. One of the things is you are stuck in a different country, you have lack of access to employment, even lack of access to national services that are available, and creating this situation where you're very vulnerable and prone to being exploited. So what role is it that member states need to take to be able to protect migrants? I don't know if we even spoke about COVID-19, the impact COVID-19 has had on migrants, the impact COVID-19 has had on victims of human trafficking, where we've seen a lot of diversion of resources moving from addressing human trafficking. And this is where we're even questioning ourselves, the issue of silos and the need for whole of government approach. There should not really be diversion of resources on curbing human trafficking, because within these, they're victims who are facing and are prone to COVID-19. Are they being denied access to vaccines? Are they being provided protection against COVID-19? So it's important. We need to really think ways of how do we include them in these discussions, and how do we ensure that the vulnerabilities that they face are addressed, because if we don't address those vulnerabilities, they are the ones who are being exploited, they're the ones who are being trafficked. And how do we even move away and regular migration, and this is where like irregular and regular migration comes in, and also re-emphasizing why it's very, very, very important for us to look at it from a victim-centered lens, human rights-based approach lens, where you're centering the victims and the survivors. And when you think of that, that's when even these questions then will come up and like, okay, what was the impact of COVID-19 on these victims? What are the needs that they need to have? Where do we need to divert resources? And yeah, so.
Thank you so much. I hope there are no other questions. I'd just like to give this moment. Or Richard, did you want to say something?
No, I think it's just to add on. I think Maria has captured it. I think any migration policies or frameworks that we want to implement, or that member states seek to implement, is we cannot just emulate, right, what the other continents are doing with the EU. If it's working in the EU, that means it will work in Africa, for instance, right? Because very often we've seen that responses are one size fits all. And I know at times member states have no options because it's very donor funded and the donor have their own objectives, and there's various aspects and complex aspects. But I think one way to look at it is that, let's look at it and let's see what are the lessons learned, right? What can, victims of trafficking tell us about these policies? Do they really work? I mean, especially for those who've managed to go and be trafficked and managed to come out, right? How do we contextualize it? If it works in the context of, South Africa, does it mean it will work in the context of, Kenya or West Africa or North Africa? It's very different. I think we need to contextualize it to see as well, and also understands that maybe the EU's view on migration and the objective is different to the one that, what Africa needs to face, right? So yeah, for me, it's just let's take this into context and contextualize it and put it in place. And at the same time as well, any measures that also have to take into consideration that wherever there's an option for, trafficking or smuggling, organized criminals always find a way around it. If you put measures in place here, they will find a way to bypass it. Et cetera, right? So it needs to be a combined effort as well, where you see how are these criminal actors, using using the opportunities to deal with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. Rubiat, I presume there are no burning questions on the floor. So I will proceed to allow the panelists to come back with their last remarks, maybe take 2 minutes each. What do you want us to go home with after this panel? What do you want us, what's your take home for us from this panel? 2 minutes each for each of the panelists, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Quickly, in terms of takeaways, I think it is very clear that we need to promote a whole of country society approach to see addressing vulnerabilities and violations within the prism of human security, ensuring that an individual has sustainable livelihood and can live in dignity. In this regard, there need to be a complementary response in terms of economic empowerment, in terms of providing jobs, providing opportunities for the youth, so that the push factor will not be there. We also need to focus on developing our border areas, in terms of the border communities are very critical to the issues of all forms of trafficking. We need to have a social protection approach and element to this. The COVID-19 pandemic really exposed Africa in terms of social protection, in terms of the vulnerable groups, especially during the lockdown and other restrictive measures. we really need, to, as ECOWAS, continue to provide that overarching oversight and trying to get member states, make them accountable for the actions, push them to put more money in the issue of promotion, in the issue of protection, not just thinking about trafficking in person or trafficking in drugs in silos. And that's why the new approach of establishing a coordination mechanism at the office of the vice president of every ECOWAS member state is a new strategic move that ECOWAS is going to build on over the years, so that there won't be issue of a disconnect between the government, the people, and also between the government and vulnerable peoples, like especially those in the border communities. We're also going to, I also want us to take away the fact that a regional approach to ensure witness and victims protection is also within the radar of ECOWAS, and that we'll continue to work and collaborate with other partners. And like I said before, going forward, ECOWAS wants to initiate dialogue with not just the Maghreb region, but also the Gulf states regarding mixed migration, irregular migration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Rahimat. Richard or Maria, 2 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Kina. Yeah, I don't think I can add much more to what Ms. Rahimat has said, but for me, it's let's look at, all the forms of organized crime are different, but they are all cause of harm, right? So human trafficking, arms trafficking, drug trafficking, they're all organized crime and should be treated as such. I would say a balancing of policies, contextualization of policies, and that can be readily implemented. We don't want policies that, just policy's sake, and implementation plans that just happens to be tick boxes, but rather implementation plan that can be implemented practically. With that, which means bringing in of the civil society, bringing of the various actors that are actively involved in the field and are experts in that. And I think that's one thing we can take away from ECOWAS, where they have a very, very, very strong civil society network, right? And I think there's something that other RECs could have a look at and develop and learn from ECOWAS from that. For me, would be also corruption, addressing corruption. I mean, once you remove corruption from the chain, it removes a whole lot of these, it dismantles these forms of organized crime. And lastly will be prevention. Very often we are very reactive. We react to after the fact it has happened, but I think prevention is key in any aspect, and I think all actors should come on board on that.
Thank you so much. Maria, final words?
Yeah, just to repeat again what my colleagues have said is the importance of collaboration between anti-trafficking actors, and also the need to incorporate anti-trafficking efforts into existing responses in other contexts, such as in humanitarian settings, the importance of proactive response and crisis mitigation planning to anti-trafficking activities, and also most important is the application of human rights-based approach, which is centering victims in all these approaches that we want to use to curb human and drug trafficking. And thank you so much for the opportunity to share.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you so much, my very eminent panel, for all the expertise that you have brought and the lots of food for thought that you have left us with as we tackle these challenges that we face as a continent. Thank you so much. And I pass the floor back to you, Rubiat. Thank you for the opportunity to chair this session.
Thank you, Ms. Ashton, for an excellent moderation, and also our panelists for accepting our invitation and for your invaluable contributions. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. Now we move to the last session, and I would like to invite Ms. Letty back to the floor for closing remarks. But before I leave the floor, I would like to ask all of you to stay with us, as we'll be taking group pictures later on following Letty's closing remarks, and thank you. Ms. Letty, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Rubiat, and good afternoon to everyone.
Thank you so much.
Excellencies, speakers and moderators have done a fantastic job today in unpacking and summarizing the topic. Above all, we were reminded that there is human trafficking. The faces of African youth, children, women, and men should always come to mind when discussing and developing policies to combat these two crimes. In summary, today's discussions included, among other things, an agreement on the floor that the two crimes of human and drug trafficking are indeed growing in Africa, and there is need, therefore, for more enhanced, practical, and workable solutions. We also heard that the COVID pandemic impact have made the situation worse because as more and more people strive to make ends meet due to huge unemployment numbers, they tend to strive to resort to desperate measures and engage in criminal activities. To this end, the African Union, REX, member states, and other development partners are working very hard to help combat the two crimes using available policy frameworks and new ones at community, regional, and continental levels. The question is, how effective and sustainable have these responses and interventions been? Speakers also listed some of the push factors, which include economic, social, and political factors. Panelists also shared practical homemade or homegrown solutions and responses, which includes community awareness raising, capacity building, and working with other partners on the ground where many of these crimes take place by engaging with multiple partners such as media, religious leaders, civil society, youth, women organizations, research institutions, and sharing of information and data. It was also stressed that both crimes fuels conflict and undermines peace and security in many ways, which often includes funding of terrorist groups and taking lives of those involved. Therefore, there is specific need for security responses and law enforcement collaborations to combat the two organized crimes. To this end, there was a suggestion on the floor that maybe in the future, the Tana Forum should separately go deeper into the two topics. We'll consider that, and though we know the two are intertwined, but we'll consider that in future and just maybe separately have two separate webinars on the two topics. We've now come to the end of our forum, and special thanks goes to the panelists, moderators, and participants for your active participation and sharing of valuable insights. I also would like to take this opportunity to thank our partner, Humanity United, for the collaboration on the Pre-Tana Forum, and we look forward to work with you on many more other follow-up events. I'd also like to thank both the IPSS and Humanity United teams for successful organization of this forum. The teams will share the outcomes report from today's discussions as soon as it is ready in the next coming weeks. Finally, as mentioned in my intro remarks earlier, we hope to see more of you or most of you at the 10th Tana Forum later this year, either physically in Bahada or virtual, where a number of pertinent sub-themes will be discussed under the overarching theme of managing security threats and building resilience for the Africa that we want. Thank you ever so much for your participation and have a great day. Rubiata, over to you.
Thank you, Leti. Now we move on to the group photo, and the first round will be for those who joined us online. So I'd like to ask all of you to turn on your video so our team can take a picture. We're done? Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. So I'd like to ask all of you who joined us here in person to approach the floor. We'll be taking a group photo here, and later on we will have tea coffee following the group picture, that is. And I'd like to thank everyone. This is Rubiat Mohammed Said, Policy Dialogues Lead at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies, and also Tana Forum Secretariat. Thank you very much.